We are up to chapter 47. I would venture to say probably sometime during the month of March we will finish up our study of Genesis. How long have we been at this? A little over a year? For our next study, we are going to the New Testament. I'm not going to give you any specific book or passage of Scripture because we're going to be looking from about 3 or 4 different ones over the concept of God's gifting and calling. We'll probably spend about 3 or 4 months looking at that. Anyway, chapter 47. You'll recall where we left off. Jacob's family had arrived in Goshen, which we know from numerous sources was considered the northeastern Nile Delta. And Jacob sent Judah on ahead to tell Joseph that they had arrived in the country. And that brings us to chapter 47. Then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, "My father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen." And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. And notice when they had arrived, Joseph didn't take all 11 brothers. In fact, we know that as we continue reading this, Jacob himself was one of the 5 apparently, because it just says he took 5 men from among his brothers. So either he took 5 brothers and Jacob, or Jacob was one of them and 4 brothers. We don't really know for sure which one, but what we can see is that obviously he didn't take all of them. Why do you suppose he only took 5? Why not Jacob and all 11 brothers?
Maybe didn't want him to think there were going to be too many of them and that they needed to fear them.
That's a good possibility because Pharaoh's not a dumb man. And if he sees that Joseph's got 11 brothers and sees how old their dad is and realizes there's grandkids and probably great-grandkids involved in this, we're already talking about a lot of people. And in the course of events, within 10 or 20 years, they'd probably doubled in size. So
they didn't want to push their luck with Pharaoh's magnanimity?
I'm sure they probably wanted to kind of keep it at least looking like, well, there's not really that many of us. Because, of course, at the time, even though they're in the land of Goshen, which was outside of kind of Pharaoh's eyesight, and keeping them separated from the rest of the Egyptians, there is a famine going on in the land. And Pharaoh knows they got 5 more years of this famine to go. And if he sees that, well, let's see, there's 70 of them, plus the women, plus maybe a bunch of the kids, and in another 5 years, there may be 30 or 40 more of them. What do you think Pharaoh's going to be thinking?
A lot of people to feed.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can afford quite that many. And Joseph probably wants to remain on Pharaoh's good side. So, anyway, then Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" So they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers." Now, when he says your servants, this is an address of deference, basically a way of offering respect to Pharaoh. He didn't just say, well, we're shepherds. He said, your servants. They're letting Pharaoh know that they recognize his authority and that they're in his backyard. So they address him with a title of respect that lets Pharaoh know that they're decent people that are going to respect him. But he does say that we're shepherds, both we and our fathers. So there's two things here. We've already discussed the fact that being a shepherd was considered kind of a second-class occupation in Egypt. And they're admitting to Pharaoh that we're just shepherd people. We are nobody important. We're, from the other side of the railroad track, so to speak.
They're also not warriors, so.
Well, that's something else I was going to mention here in a minute, but we'll get to that in just a second. He says, both we and our fathers. So by that, they're confirming for Pharaoh that this has been a family occupation. So it's not just a few of us. The whole family has been doing this for some time, which would tell Pharaoh what?
They were good at it, and they weren't likely to want to change what they did.
Well, good at it, maybe, maybe not. But the second thing is the issue here. Kind of lets Pharaoh know that the likelihood is that the next generation's also going to be shepherds and not going to be what Connie just mentioned. Because here's the issue that would have been of interest to Pharaoh, and also it is believed one of the biggest reasons that after this, when this Pharaoh died and was replaced by a native Egyptian that the Bible refers to as a Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph, this is one of the biggest reasons why it is believed that the Egyptians enslaved the Jews. Going all the way back to Abraham, what do we know about Abraham's expertise?
He was a military man.
He had a military mind about him, and he was definitely a leader that knew how to wage war. Now, we don't have at this point in history any confirmation of this, but it is believed that Abraham probably taught his boys, and then naturally each generation after that, the art of war. That if you're going to go to war against somebody, here's what you need to know and here's what you need to do. And of course, when they came down there, it wasn't just them. They had a pile of servants with them. Now, evidence in favor of that possibility is, once the Exodus occurred, what was one of the first things God told, the Jews to do? Other than just...
swords, plowshares.
What's that?
You talking about plowshares and swords and stuff? Or?
Uh-uh. When they began the conquest of the Promised Land, what indication do we have that God taught them how to wage war?
None.
None. Why? Because they apparently already knew how to wage war. God led them and God told them He would bless them, but it is believed by many historians and theologians that the nation of Israel were basically military minded and an entire nation of soldiers from the very beginning, that each generation taught the next how to go into battle, how to wage war, and that went all the way back to Abraham and his family, that they were in fact a family of professional soldiers.
It's amazing they were able to do that while they were enslaved.
There's a lot of things that can go on, inside the tent and behind the, you might not be able to practice and train, but you can sure pass on the information.
Or trained in secret.
At night or whatever. But the fact that they apparently had this knowledge, it is believed may have gone a long way toward convincing the next Pharaoh that we need to subjugate these people before they subjugate us. And the only thing that enabled them to do that is the Egyptians just far outnumbered them. And of course, if you do know anything about the military, you know that if you're going to wage war, it helps to be the one with the most people. And the Egyptians definitely outnumbered the Israelites at this point. So anyway, now back to this. Even back then, it is believed that these Semitic people from that area of the world had a reputation for being warlike. And so one of the first things out of their mouths is, now we're not soldiers, we're shepherds. Probably among the least that you would expect to be a military threat. All right, so they said to Pharaoh, we've come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen. Now, the way they mention this, it says, you'll notice that what they requested of Pharaoh was not that we're here to migrate to Egypt. They said, we want to sojourn. In other words, we're just here temporarily. We just want to be here till the famine's over, because they led Pharaoh to believe the famine is worse to the north of here. So we just want to be here long enough for the famine to be over, and then we'll leave and go home. That's the implication of what they're telling Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. Now, here we have a major change here. Pharaoh is assuming that if they're professional shepherds, they are probably good at what they do. And Pharaoh says, put them in charge of mine. Why does Pharaoh want them in charge of his livestock?
Because his own people don't want to do it.
His own people don't want to do it. Exactly. Pharaoh's apparently got some livestock. He don't want to do it because he's Pharaoh. He doesn't want his servants dealing with it because, well, they're my servants. I don't want them out in the field dealing with the livestock. So he tells Joseph, said, put your family in charge of that, because I can't find any of these Egyptians around here that actually want to do this. Plus, if they've got his livestock, gives Pharaoh and his servants the excuse to be able to go up and check on them every once in a while. Make sure everything's okay and that that's all they're doing. Joseph is not going to object to this because, again, if they're taking care of Pharaoh's livestock, he knows Pharaoh's not going to make them leave anytime soon. Now, there's a second reason involved in all this that is not immediately apparent, but is probably there. Now, as I mentioned to you last week, and I think even the week before that, a lot of historians believe this particular Pharaoh may have himself been of Semitic origin and was not a native Egyptian, which is one of the reasons why after this, not too many years later, in fact, it was believed to be probably about 20 years after this, this Pharaoh was either died and was simply replaced by a native Egyptian, or more likely he was overthrown. Because it is believed that he might not have been a native Egyptian. With that in mind, now, what I'm about to throw out here is pure speculation. It's what some historians think may have happened, but we do not know for sure, and we certainly can't make a biblical case for it. But here it is. We do know that Pharaoh trusted Joseph. What is one of the reasons Pharaoh trusted Joseph?
Ability to interpret the dreams.
He
And-
didn't give him any reason to. worry because
Well,
he done a good job.
He has done him a good job. And Pharaoh has noticed that everything Joseph has had his hands in, what happened?
Turns to gold.
It turns to gold. Joseph is a blessed man. And because he was able to interpret these dreams, what does Pharaoh believe about Joseph?
Good connection with God.
He's got a direct connection with God. Now here's the speculation part. Some people believe that while I haven't come across any commentary that claims that Pharaoh was a saved man. Not making that claim at all. But what some people possibly believe is that if Pharaoh was of Semitic origin, Pharaoh may have at least been familiar with the God that Joseph worshiped. He'd heard of Yahweh before. And if that's true, it's highly likely that he may have been familiar with, or at least heard about Abraham. We know Abraham had been to Egypt before. If Pharaoh, not saying Pharaoh worshiped Joseph's God, but if he was at least familiar with this God that Joseph worshiped and saw that everything Joseph did, Joseph prospered, and Joseph has already proven that he's blessed enough of his God to interpret dreams. Well, now guess what? Joseph's whole family is here, and Joseph's father, who said has come with a whole pile of livestock, clearly, what does that tell Pharaoh?
More blessed.
This whole family is blessed. And if this whole family has been blessed by his God, I want them next to me. Because what do a lot of people believe about stuff like that?
Rubs off.
Yeah. And we've already seen that Joseph has proven that, because Pharaoh by this point is already getting rich. And why is he getting rich? Because he's got Joseph at the helm, and everything, as you just mentioned, everything Joseph touches turns to gold. So he figures, not only have I got Joseph at my disposal, now I got his whole family.
I got Joseph's God at my disposal.
Including the patriarch, which means exactly, if Joseph's God has blessed him, maybe Joseph's God will bless me. And go ahead.
I was going to just kind of segue back. My study notes address that Semitic origin of this Pharaoh. It says that they were the Hyksos, or shepherd kings. Hundreds of years before Joseph's time had invaded and conquered Lower Egypt and ruled the Delta. And it said that, further down it says that some writers suggest they were the progenitors of the Bedouins, and that the Amalekites, Midianites, and other hostile nations who opposed the Israelites after the Exodus were also descended from the same stock.
Mm-hmm.
And possibly even the Philistines trace their origin back to those people.
All from that same Semitic common ancestor, which would have been probably a generation or two before Abraham. All Semitic. But yes, it would tell us that there's a good possibility, not saying that Pharaoh worshiped that God, but that he at least knew of these Semitic gods and figured, if I can get them up close to me, I'll get blessed. It rubs off.
Yeah, he could see the results of that God's blessing upon Joseph for himself.
Already, yes. Now, do we know that that's his motivation? No, but there's a good possibility of it. All right. Verse 7, then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Now, verse 7 is an important issue here. A foreigner who he's never met before, just happens to be Joseph's father, who's himself just a shepherd, comes into Pharaoh's presence and dares to pronounce a blessing on him. Now,
he doesn't ask for the king's blessing. He gives the king a blessing.
He gives the king a blessing.
That's like completely backwards.
Which tells, as Merrill mentioned, socially speaking, that's kind of backward. That Jacob dared to pronounce a blessing on Pharaoh, which if person A blesses person B, what is the implication of their social status?
They're above.
Person A is the one who's the senior of the two. Now, in any other situation, Pharaoh would have been, at the very least, annoyed with that. But we see that in the ensuing conversation, Pharaoh apparently isn't in the least bit annoyed by this. Multiple reasons. One of the next things that we're going to see is he asked Jacob how old he is. So Pharaoh is apparently several years Jacob's junior. So he's receiving a blessing from someone that's probably way older than him. Secondly, if in fact this Pharaoh is himself of Semitic origin, he figures, okay, somewhere in our background, we're connected here. So he's not offended by this, especially if he thinks that if the God of Joseph has blessed him, and now Joseph's dad has pronounced a blessing on me, hey, bring it on.
His court officials must have been aghast though when it happened. Like, oh, what are you doing?
Possibly, if they were all native Egyptians who, didn't know about Joseph's God. But yes, there's a definite faux pas, if you will, as far as normal court procedure here, for Jacob to come in and right off the bat blesses Pharaoh. Jacob is establishing that even though he may be just an old man and he's in the presence of the king, he's letting the king know that, I'm kind of the senior here, although it's not stated. And notice the next thing Pharaoh asked him, verse 8, Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many years have you lived? So Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. So he tells him, said, I'm 130 years old, so I've been around a while, but even I'm not as old as my ancestors lived, and I've lived a pretty hard life. Well, if you tell somebody that you've been living a hard life, what does that kind of imply?
Has been a little bit of roses.
Well, not just that, but I've learned a lot of things and got a lot of wisdom from the school of hard knocks. To tell somebody that your life has been hard, what do we, anytime we naturally assume the guy's learned a few things.
That's built some character.
He's built some character here. And Jacob's admitting that, in a sense, without giving any details, that he's suffered the consequences of dumb decisions that he's made early on. That his life hasn't been easy. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Jacob blesses Pharaoh when he comes in and blesses him again when he goes out. A double blessing. If Pharaoh indeed had any respect at all for the God that Jacob worshiped, or at least recognized that Jacob was himself a blessed man, Pharaoh by this point must be thinking, I'm doing pretty good. I just got a double blessing from that old man. And if God has blessed him, I ought to do pretty good from here on out.
That's what worries me with him saying that basically he's had a hard life, though. Pharaoh, when Pharaoh's looking for blessings.
Well,
it's
maybe.
Yeah, it just makes me wonder.
But when you figure, the fact that at this point, we know, common sense tells us Pharaoh's been told at this point that this guy just brought in, however many, hundreds of head of cattle, and this many sheep and oxen and this and that and what have you. And we don't know, hadn't counted them yet, but there must be at least 100 of them people out there. I mean, let's face it, Pharaoh's the king. He's been told. Even if Joseph hasn't owned up to it, you know somebody's whispered in Pharaoh's ear that this is what's going on. So Pharaoh can see that even if he's lived a hard life, this man has just come in filthy rich. Because back then, riches were not measured by how much money you had in the bank. How did they measure riches? Livestock, grain, land, family.
Stuff.
So this guy has just come in with who knows how many hundreds of head of cattle, a family that probably, we know there were at least 70 that were counted, and if they didn't count the women and probably some, and the girls and what have you, we're looking at probably well over 100 family members. Pharaoh's thinking this man has been blessed. He may have had a hard life, but God's blessed him for that. Pharaoh realizes that this man standing before him, he may look simple, but he's got money. At least in what they would consider money. All right, verse 11. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had ordered. Now, when it says Ramesses or Ramses, however some people pronounce it, this was not the name of this Pharaoh. Ramses actually was a Pharaoh from an earlier dynasty.
There were several different Ramses.
And there were. That's another thing. So this is a name that was actually within the pharaohs of Egypt was fairly common. So the fact that this land to the Egyptians was called the land of Ramses or Ramesses shouldn't be of any indication about this particular pharaoh. All that tells us is that it was a common name and a distinguished name at that time. So they called it, the land of Ramesses. Everybody else, the Hebrews and what have you, referred to it as the land of Goshen. Now, notice, it didn't just say they were told to hang out here for a few years. It said gave them a possession. Pharaoh apparently ordered that the land be given to them. Why do you suppose Pharaoh would tell them that you can let them have this land?
Hang around.
He wants them to hang around for a while. Clearly, at this point in history, this Pharaoh does not see them as a threat. Quite the opposite. He sees their presence as a blessing. And what do you want? What do you want to do when you figure that somebody who's been blessed by God, if they hang around, I'll get some of their blessing on me. So what do you naturally want to do? You want to keep them close for a while. Verse 12, and Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to their little ones. Now, that's a lot of food, especially in the middle of this kind of a famine. This is as far as we're going to go for this evening. We're going to stop at verse 12. But what we see here is, unlike what happens in the next generation, this migration to Egypt is under very friendly terms. They're welcomed in Egypt. They have no reason at all to be concerned. And in fact, God even told Jacob before they got there, he's going to go with him and protect him. So, this is a good thing at this point. And I think, as Merrill might have mentioned last week, the only way any of this would have occurred is God orchestrated all of this in order to do one thing which Joseph has already recognized. God put us all here to save this remnant. Because what's God's ultimate plan in all this?
Saving as many of us as he can.
Well, not just that, but to save the Messianic line. Yeah. God's got a promise to keep. And that means saving Jacob's family. questions this evening? All right. Let's sing our